Well, it's great to see everybody here. We'll move on to our grazing planning component. Yeah, this up so I can see. Excellent. Now I can still see all the people, which is what I wanted. I didn't have last week. So same as Bernard, I thought we'd just go through a bit of a review, but just to say where we're up to today. So we're going to look at grazing, overgrazing, growth rates, recovery periods, grazing periods, and measuring forage. The sort of the fundamentals of getting us started of what we're doing. If you've got any questions as we go through, as Bernard said, please, pipe up. We've got time as we're going through these programs to be able to take your questions, because we sort of don't have a set end point in the program. We've got plenty of time in the next few weeks that we're going through this to cover all this. So jump in with your own questions. Craig, please feel free to jump in with any of your inputs. Craig's with us as another educator. He's highly experienced and grazing manager. And I always value his input. I'm on the phone to him pretty regularly. All right.
Glen.
Yes.
I've been playing around. I've been playing around with some of your the figures to working out my animal days and working out grazing days.
Yes.
Why, when you actually work it out, you're supposed to come up with your forage, animal forage days. Why do you need to know that?
Well, that's a great question, and we will cover off that today so that you can have a look at it. So you've been out doing your feed squares, Paul?
Very, very roughly, of course, just to try and get my head around the whole.
Yeah. All right. I've got that here, and we'll come back to it in later on as we go through. So thanks for that. So just to recap what we're doing here. So we're looking at managing in our environments, those 4 ecosystem processes. So if you come back to your holistic context, you'll have a description in there of what you want your future resource base of your land to be like, and that should be around how's it performing, what's the water cycle look like, what's the landscape doing, and how's it performing. Leading on from what we've just listened for Bernard, profitability and this ecosystem process go hand in hand. That's the true profit. So if we're improving these 4 cycles at the same time as creating profit, then that's where we hit that true profit. And by increasing these, we are able to improve our ability to create that profit and that financial surplus for ourselves and our communities. And it's this increasing spiral effect as we go through it. The soil surface is being covered as critical to maintaining all of these. That's that interaction with water falling on the landscape, energy hitting the landscape, feeding the biology within the soil system, from getting minerals from above the ground into below the ground. It all comes down to that soil surface is that critical in ensuring that those 4 functions, services function properly. Excuse me, sorry. And because we all are in those brittle tending environments, mostly in Australia, then that's where having animals in our landscape ensures that we're actually getting that material from above the surface, because we don't have that biological activity on a constant basis above the land. So we have to have it interacting with that soil surface to keep that flowing. Remembering that these are like the equal sides of that tetrahedron. So if we increase or decrease one of those, it affects all of those. So they interact with each other on a constant basis. So if we actually focus on, improving, biodiversity and community dynamics, it will inherently improve our energy flow, our water cycles, and our mineral cycling anyway. So it doesn't really matter which one that you have as a focus for yourself, because they all actually give us a benefit that benefit all the others. So one thing I didn't bring up last week, I thought I'd just chuck this in here just for you to think about, is one of the things we talk in managing our landscapes is the rule of succession. And this is really important when we're talking about how to transition into better community dynamics and improved energy capture and mineral cycling within the system, because we want to have higher succession plants and higher and in the environment, so that we're actually able to do that stuff more efficiently. So how do we actually do that? And this is where the rule of succession comes in. Then I'll just read it out as it's stated there. A species will move into an environment when the conditions are stable for its establishment, and it will move out of the environment when its conditions become unsuitable for reproduction. So what this is really saying is that plants in our environment are there because the conditions suit them. Okay. And if we want to make a change or an improvement in that, or if we see a plant coming in because something's happened to detriment that, the conditions have changed. So we have the ability with our management of actually moving those things forward. And this comes into, plant people class as weeds mostly, but I call them, transition plants generally, where they will have an example this year. I'm noticing a lot of saffron thistles popping up across the region, and it's the conditions that we have this year environmentally, our grazing patterns that happen in the past, temperatures, all these things have actually come together that's suiting that plant. But it's also there trying to provide ecosystem services in putting a taproot down. It's actually still photosynthesizing in the environment, doing all sorts of things. Now, if we want to transition to something that's not all spiky and you're not great in our wool and things like that, then we need to look at how we actually move that forward in succession and change the conditions. So focusing on deep-rooted perennials that fill the space on the ground all the time, cover that soil surface, are actually cycling minerals, and having both winter and summer perennials through the system allow us to actually have a higher succession area. So when you're thinking about managing plants in your landscape and changing things for yourself, then this rule is a really good thing to come back and think about. And I always sort of try to come back to that item within the decision checks, which is the root cause, is what's causing this to happen? Why is this plant here? What's happened? Have I influenced it? Is it something that's happened in nature? And how do we change that to move forward? So who creates the conditions is what key. So can we create the conditions, or is it something that happened to the environment, and how has that happened? So what do we need to change? I drive past a few paddocks at the moment, heading out to our property, and there's some significant fence line effects around, and there's like paddocks of 100% white daisies in a paddock. You go through the fence line and it's completely changed. So soil conditions, general climatic conditions and everything else is all exactly the same for those two paddocks. What's different is the management of that landscape. And in one paddock, they've had the conditions that suit that particular plant, and in the next, completely different, and it's changed. So we need to, that's where our management comes into these processes. So we're talking about the the tools that we have. Open our toolbox wide, look at all the tools that we have available. So time, which is looking at our rest. The one that's missing off this one, which I tend to take out now, is fire. Can judiciously use it, but I should put that back in there. Living organisms, large and small. So we've got grazing and animal impact, which we'll talk about, stock density in this, but we've also got things like pasture crops, composts, sprays, and ecological, biological sprays and things like that. And then we've got things like technology, where we can use fencing, computers, water, tank monitors, all sorts of things that help us with our management of our landscape. So when we're talking about grazing and animals as a tool, we're looking at the management factors of recovery and graze period. We're looking at our stocking rate and our utilization and density and what we can do in those. There's sort of some of the things we're looking at. So if we think about stocking rate, this is stocking across the whole of the land that we are managing, whereas our utilization and density can be focused on a particular paddock. So that's the distinction between those. So we both want to match our stocking rate to our carrying capacity. That's across our landscape. but we also want to improve our utilization of what we've got available and then density to help us actually make changes within that landscape that we're working with. So guidelines we've got here is population management. What's our stocking rate? As I just said, we can change that. How do we move it up and down? How do we match what our seasonal conditions are? So what our carrying capacity changes from season to season, year to year, and how do we actually manage that population? We're managing our time. So what's our grazing periods, and what is more importantly, what's our recovery time? How long is it taking plants to recover? Our stock density is our animal impact and utilization thing. So how many animals have we got per area of landscape, and what's their impact? And then herd effect, I usually think about this as slightly different to stock density in that we can actually utilize animals to impact smaller areas. So we can look at bare ground, like I might have a scald or a dam wall that we've done some repair on, or maybe even a particular plant that's in an area, and we want to change the conditions to get away from that. So we can actually use things like attractants and supplement stations and things like that to utilize the herd impact on that area. And that can be whether it's with sheep or cattle. And it's interesting, sheep can have a huge herd impact, running 250 lambs through a yard the other day where it had about 4 foot of phalaris. Once they all come out of that paddock, all that phalaris was sitting on the ground. They'd actually got the density and the herd effect high enough so that they weren't eating a high portion of it, but it was actually down at that soil surface, so that it's actually then going to start to break that down and get that mineral cycling. So, quick question for you. What are some of the management factors that we would individually be managing on our farms? So when you're talking about managing your animals or managing your landscape, what are some of the things that we need to consider when we're trying to manage our grazing? Yep, go Clint.
I was just going to say the infrastructure that's in place.
Yeah, what's our infrastructure? Yep. Sam?
I was going to put down the cycles for the animals. So breeding, joining.
Yep.
All
breeding,
of those.
Joining, weaning, all those sort of things. Yep.
All those things.
Yep. Yep. Any others?
Rainfall?
Yep. What's our rainfall? What's our rainfall pattern? Yep. When's it going to be wet? When's the paddock going to be boggy? It could be when's the dam not going to have water in it, or when's the creek going to flood? Those sorts of things. Yep. Definitely. Any others?
Keeping as much feed as possible in front of the cattle or the stock.
Yep, keeping the feed in front of the cattle. Yeah, what's their nutritional requirements? And that goes in with what Sam said. Are we leading up to weaning? Are we trying to join cattle? Lots of things. Yeah, so making sure that's there. It could be when we've got fences to repair, or when we've got staff available, or when the kids are home from holidays, or we want to go on holidays ourselves. So there's a whole range of management factors that we need to factor into our planning process. And this is why the holistic plan grazing process allows us to manage that complexity. So we try and keep it in our head, and many people, put it in a diary, or we try to do those sorts of things. But generally what happens in that is we then turn it into a system. So we'll go, okay, well, I've got 54 paddocks and I'll rotate, or 20 paddocks, I'll rotate around on 2 days a paddock, and that's, we turn into systems. The holistic plan grazing process allows us to actually handle complexity and build that in, so we're actually focused around having a better process rather than a fixed rigid system. And this is where people have got caught in the past when they've gone to time control grazing and things like that, in that we haven't been focusing on necessary nutritional factors of the animals, or timings of when people are going to be away, and the social factors. And the other one is management factors. How much finances have we got? How much wealth generating expenses have we got to spend to be able to make improvements or changes to our landscape or our management ability? So that's context specific for you and your situation. So the other reason that we plan our grazing is we're using the animals as a tool. So not only are we, creating wool or beef or sheep meat or whatever it happens to be from an economic and enterprise point of view, but we're also using them as a landscape management tool to improve those ecosystem processes. So, and as we talked about, that true profit situation means that we want to actually do both of those things at the same time. And by improving those ecosystem processes, we're improving our long-term stability. So we actually have less impact from rainfall or heat events like we're having in New South Wales at the moment. We've had in the previous states just recently. Whether it's big floods or dries, those things become more stable because we've got actually a more higher functioning ecosystem with those four processes. So we have sustainability, and that reduces the risk in our businesses. So the necessity to go to the bank and get money because we can't actually we need to buy feed or something like that to get us through a dry period. So if we've got that stability, we're reducing our risk of not being able to produce. And the other one is management and profit, which is what I've just talked about. Having animals and people happy. So we want to be enjoying what we're doing. And I just saw another agribusiness who's promoting a program at the moment talking about burnout. And I thought that's a really interesting focus for people. Whereas if you actually have your context forefront for yourself all the time, and you're working towards achieving that quality of life statement for you, which is actually something you can live today, then the discussion around burnout probably isn't one that's necessary, because you'll actually be doing what you need to do to create your context. And at the same time, we're looking at how we're performing from a business point of view. So are our animals nutritionally performing? Are they growing right? All those sorts of things. So I've just been doing analysis yesterday afternoon and this morning, because we weighed all our finishing stock. And so I've got young calves that are still on cows. I've got calves which were weaned last year, and I've got yearlings that we're processing for our meat business at the moment, and looking at all the different growth rates through the seasonal conditions, and then looking at saying, okay, how can I both continue to use them as a tool in my landscape, but improve my productivity so that my gross margin that I'm producing improves as well, because I'm going to get more kilos of meat put on. So the key actions we are in our grazing is that we're planning our management and people issues first. So we're always thinking about, when are we going to go on our holidays? When are we going to take a break, for example? What are the management issues that are going to affect the whole of our landscape? So when are we going to be weaning? When are we going to be joining? When will we have labour available? All those sorts of things. We look and we list those and we manage those first, so look at those first. We plan and monitor our recovery of our plants, and we'll get into that in a second as far as how we do that. But that's one of the key to improving the longevity of our perennials, so that we actually can have them be perennial rather than something that's become the norm in the industry, in that you have to re-sow your pastures every 5 to 6 years. And I saw a video yesterday of a particular input company that's in the compost and biological space, talking to someone about cover crops, and they've moved to having a constant annual cover crop system because they can produce more profit off it than what they could, because they always had to replace their perennial pastures. And all I thought of when I saw that is said, well, hang on, if we're having to replace a plant that should be there permanently, then our management is impacting that in some way. So this is where the focus on recovery of plants and the health of those key perennials is critical in our grazing planning. Matching our stocking rate to our current capacity. So this then blends over our financial planning, because we need to have enterprise mixes within our business that allow us to have flexibility of that stocking rate. So if we've got a breeding enterprise and we have a long-term carrying capacity for our landscape, and we maintain our breeding stock right up at the top of that long-term carrying capacity, and we've got to focus on keeping these really good genetics, then when seasonal conditions change, we get ourselves caught, because we don't want to get rid of cows that we've spent a lot of time and effort in getting genetics. This is the paradigm. And so we actually then start doing things economically that affect us, like buying feed and those sorts of things. Whereas if we're actually able to come back a step strategically and say, well, I know that I'm going to have good seasons and bad seasons. I know we're going to have good rainfall and poor rainfall, hot and cold, and all those sorts of things. So how do I actually set up a business with enterprise mixes that allows me to actually have flexibility as nature would in the landscape? So that's what we're trying to mimic, a natural increases in population. So when there's a boom, really good season, how do we take advantage of it? When we've got a poor season, where rainfall's down, things like that, how do I actually keep looking after my landscape whilst continuing to be economically viable? So, so matching, but the key here is stocking rate to carrying capacity. So what's our land's carrying capacity in the season that we are in? Where are we? And how are we trending over time with that carrying capacity, but how do we actually vary that stocking rate? We want to look at decreasing our mobs and increasing our number of paddocks. And we'll look at what the impact of that is in a second. Maximizing our density over time, which leads on from the previous two items. And we're monitoring animal performance. So we've got to ensure that we're still focusing around the economic and productivity parts of our business. So we still want good performing animals. So we want to look at how we actually do that, what the monitoring is for that. And then on a long-term basis, we're looking at how we're actually monitoring our landscapes to ensure that as we go through year to year, season to season, that actually we are improving. Has our soil surface been covered more? Have we got more infiltration rates? Have we got increasing carbon? Have we got more perennial species? All those sorts of things is our long-term monitoring process that we want to make sure we've got in place.
Glen, how do you match decrease mobs when you've got weaners? And I have a situation where I can yard wean for 4 weeks. When I put the heifers back in with the cows and the heifers get back together and they start milking again. So how do you manage it to decrease your mobs when you need to have weaners separate?
Yeah, well, we want to decrease as much as we can, but there are times when we need to do that. And yeah, we've had that situation ourselves where we actually moved some adjustment weaners off one of our properties to the other. And then and it was probably, I think it was nearly 6 months later, those heifers that the adjuster had selected to keep and breed went back to our breeding property. And I think it was only one, but it was one of the heifers then went back to mum and found her again and started to try and suckle on her. That was a fair point. So there are some issues around that, and looking at how, so we want to look at how we can both have that rotation going. And there are some strategies, Paul, which we can get into, and looking at how you might be able to set up your property in farmlets, but it all comes down to how many paddocks you have available for us to be able to manage multiple mobs. So
can I just make a comment there, Glen?
Yes, Sam. Yeah, go.
Paul, we in our situation, just use weaning rings on the weaners, and they don't separate off the mum.
Yeah, we're using weaning rings as well, and we tend to find they work. The other thing you can do, though, Paul, is also think, and we can get into this into a further session, but using a leader-follower type grazing plan where you might have the two mobs in 2 paddocks, but they're directly next to each other moving forward, so that we can still maintain our recovery period. So there are some strategies we can put in place, and it sort of comes down to what your resources as far as paddocks and things like that are available.
Does that idea work with having cattle go first and then the sheep following straight behind?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of holistic grazers do that because there's some benefits in cattle consuming some of the worm burden that don't go with the sheep, and also if you've got especially the season we've got up here at the moment, they can go through and take out a lot of the taller material, and then the sheep come in behind, and they've actually got a more open pasture sward to be able to get through that as well. So there's some benefits in doing that as well. And I do know of people who are running a 3 mob leader follower. So they'll have actually 3 mobs in 3 paddocks for following each other around. And what they've got is The first mob is their finishing mob that they want the best feed for, and they're about to send them off to processing. And then they've got their cattle breeding mob, and then they'll have dry stock and things that have less nutritional requirements in the final one, so that they can improve their management as far as splitting their mobs. But they've still got they do have a compromise in recovery period, but it's a much less because they're running in very close to each other or right behind each other. So we'll have a look at that as we go forward, Paul. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay.
I'll just put a note here, so I remember to come back again. All right, so planned grazing, what are we actually doing? So we're getting our animals in the right place at the right time for the right reasons, and Craig's dropped off, but he added to this with the right behavior. So what are some of the right times or right reasons that we might have for having animals in particular particular places on our land?
There's been adequate recovery in that area.
Yep, adequate recovery. We could also, one of the things we look at in planning when we're talking about management is when are we going to be weaning, or when do we need to weigh stock or shear stock? So we want them to be next to the sheep yards or next to the cattle yards at that time rather than on the other end of the property. So we've got to have them in the right place so we can actually plan that process around. So any other reasons?
Have you fattening stock on the best feed possible?
Yeah. So just as we were talking before, which stock do we want to be finishing, and what feed we've got available? Where's the best paddocks for those? What paddocks do we want to lamb or calve in? All these, they're all reasons and timing things that we need to put in place. So and a lot, as we're hearing, there's a lot of complexity around this, and this is where the planning process allows us to take that into account. So some of the reasons, as you said, animal nutrition. So have I got cows that I want on a rising plane of nutrition when I want to join them? Are they in the right body condition? We might need to manage particular grasses. We might have particular species in different areas. We might want to do something there. And improving our landscape improvement. So is there a particular paddock that we know has grass at during summer, so I can really put some impact on that to help improve it? Animal husbandry, as I said, we want to be able to have animals near our facilities at the right time. So we're not moving them from the other end of the property to our cattle yards or our sheep yards when we want to do something. And as we said, calving and lambing. So where are we going to calve? How are we going to manage that? What's going to happen in that process? So these are all reasons. So what do we need to know to plan a grazing? We need to know how much my stock eat, how much I have available. We need to know, as we've been talking, about any special requirements that the stock needs. So am I trying to finish? Am I trying to, are they lactating? Those sorts of things. Are there any special land needs? Am I trying to get some animal impact on a particular area, or am I trying to eat a particular grass species or plant species? How fast are things growing? So how fast is our recovery, and how long will the feed last that I've got? Okay, so those are all things that we need to know to be able to do our grazing planning. So one of the key ones there is ensuring we've got to focus on recovery. So most of our decisions are generally, or people talk about how long we've been grazing in a paddock, and you'll jump online and see many discussions going, well, I move every day, or I do multiple moves a day, those sorts of things. But whenever I'm asking a question to someone, I don't really actually care too much about their grazing time. I'm more interested in their recovery time. How long are they letting the landscape recover between the time that they graze and when they come back again? And has that plants, or the plants that they're grazing, been able to replenish themselves and recover back to what it was like before they grazed? So we need to move from that thought process to that recovery of our pasture. So whenever you're looking at your grazing, I want you to be focusing on your recovery of your plants. You know, when am I going to, if you're in a non-growing season, when are they actually going to start to grow again, and how, you know, there's some timing things there. And in the growing season, how fast is things going? How long do I need to leave this paddock ungrazed for the plants to be recovered and get that energy back into their system, and to improve and grow more roots and grow more leaves, so that we're actually improving from graze to graze and season to season. So the when of plan and grazing is we do it generally twice a year. So we have our a growing season and an on-growing season. In some areas, and you guys are all from different areas, you might have a growing and a slow growing season. So you might not actually go into an area where it doesn't grow. And if you're in sort of the central part of New South Wales, sort of Dubbo down to, you know, Cowra, Grenfell, sort of a strip across there, in the higher rainfall zone, you'd be probably in a slow growing season and a growing season. We're probably similar up here because of the changes that we've made in our pastures. So on the northern tablelands where I'm from, we'll have, you know, cold, drier winters, and generally though it's not, it's more about the temperature that's stopping things from growing more than the moisture. If we get a unicorn average rainfall through the winter, then we can still do that. But if you look around different landscapes, you'll see, based on management, we might have a distinct growing or non-growing. If you go further south into more Mediterranean style environments, you know, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, then you have a distinct, you know, wet, slow growing winter, very, very fast growing spring, and then a hot, dry end to your summer where you'll have virtually no growth. So we do that. And if you go then up into, say, further up into Queensland, you get into, you know, a monsoonal summer wet and a winter dry. So you'll have a cycle within your area, and this is where we have a look at. So in our growing season, our focus is on increasing our forage in our paddocks, so that as each time we go through a paddock, we want to be actually have this little cycle where every time I come back, I've got a little bit more than there was after I left last time. And the reason we have to do that is because when we get to this dormant season, or this non-growing, slow-growing season, I've got to have basically a resource base of pasture in my paddocks so that I actually can get through that season ready until the next growing season comes. Okay, so if we're always constantly eating all of the grass in our paddocks right through this growing season, we come out, say, down here somewhere, then we've actually got less ability to get through that next season. And that's where you know, a lot of people might actually be cutting forage in their paddocks here when they might have excess. They'll be doing hay, whereas I'd prefer to have that hay effectively standing in the paddock. It costs me less money to do that, and I can utilize that through that next season. Now, I'll bring this up here now. We've got this little thing here called the reserve. So when we're actually planning our fodder through this non-growing season, we actually plan it not to where we would normally expect the growing season to start, but actually past that, because invariably that season doesn't break at the same time every year. And so we want to have a reserve in place so that if it's late, we've got enough there to be able to go further out. That gives us time to make some decisions based on the seasonal conditions, and there's things around critical dates that we put into our grazing plans with regards to that. So depending on where you are, as I said, this is, for example, say North Coast New South Wales, summer dominant rainfall, and here's the growth patterns of various different pastures. So we've got naturalized carpet grass with no fertilizer. We've got, say, a Soteria, Rhodes grass and clover, paspalum or kikuyu. Now, if you've got a paddock that might be just this natural carpet grass and paspalum, then your non-growing season is probably starting here about mid-April. But if you've got, you know, say a kikuyu-based pasture, you'll actually have more grass growing right out until, say, the end of May. Okay, so it depends on your pasture. So in this case, if you're wanting to improve things, you could actually move to create more diversity. I wouldn't, you know, get rid of the paspalum and things, but I would be adding you know, a bit of cockatoo and various other diversity. So that's then extending my growing season. And then on the other side of that, you know, or then if you naturalize, you know, carpet grass, then you're way back, you're back here. So you've got to look at where your grasses are. So some of this is data is available for different regions. So you can actually source it out and see what it is, and then you can actually adjust it. I've got a spreadsheet that I've collected some growth data from all different pasture types in different regions. And so we can actually produce some of these graphs for different areas. So when we're planning, we're going to go out here and say, well, when are we getting actually consistent growth in our pastures? So this will be the start of our growing season again. So in this case, it's going to be, say, mid-September. And so this is our non-growing season. So we're going to have very, very little pasture growth through this period. So how do we actually maintain our stock's nutrition and maintain their performance from, say, mid-May through to mid-September? Okay. Then we'll actually say, well, when the season doesn't break, it actually can go right out until mid-November. And this happened last year for this region and the North Coast, is that we didn't get our spring rain, and the summer rain didn't actually start until mid-November. And so we want to actually have this as our reserve. Okay, so actually whatever grass we've got here at this grey line needs to actually last us right through until this reserve. And what that does is two things. One, as I said, gives us the ability to make decisions around matching our stocking rate to the carrying capacity. But it also means that if we're leaving, say, 20 to 30% of our pasture for this reserve, then we're actually leaving a residual on that landscape all the time. And the only time that we break into that residual is if we actually need to get into that reserve. So most years we might not even utilize this reserve, but it's there if we need it. So if you look at what our total forage is on hand, as we go through this growing season, we want to grow more and more and more and more, so that when we get to the start of this non-growing, we're sort of at our peak, what's in our paddocks, and then we can actually then start to consume that right down. Now, if we go going right through our reserve, we'll consume it right down to this level. Now, we then may need to destock, or we probably started destocking further earlier. But this would be the point, is if we get to here and the season hasn't broken, we've gone into a persistent drought, then we would look at destocking the landscape to look after it. But if we get to this point here and the season does, then actually our feed reserve starts to rise from this point going up then. If we look at the same sort of thing for down south, the graph looks the same, but the dates have changed on the bottom. So we're looking at September, October, November at the start of the graph here, whereas this was in January, February. So we've got a season here where we've got our growing season through until sort of November, December, and then it doesn't start to grow again. And you can see here we've got sort of slow growth through June, July, and August. And it's not until we get into September, October, as the temperature warms up, we really start to get growth. There's our non-growing season. So in this case, it's a lot longer. So we've got six or 7 months of non-growing. We might have a reserve there as well. And so we actually need our grass to actually last us right through that period. Okay. So this is what we're looking at. So Paul, to your question around doing your feed assessments, this starts to give us some information about how much I have available, how long does it need me to last, especially in the non-growing season. But in the growing season is how much have I got, how fast is it growing, and how many stock can I put on or need to put on to be able to take advantage of the opportunity I might have. So there's some couple of benefits there from knowing how much feed we've got and then how much our particular animals eat. So going back to the grazing and overgrazing discussion. So we've got a couple of pictures here. And this is really a classic one, and you might be able to go into your paddocks and have a look at your grasses. One of the characteristics of a grass that's been overgrazed is that they tend to try and grow really flat to the ground. They're trying to protect themselves. They're perennial. They want to survive. They need to have that basal plant sort of maintained. And so if they continually get grazed, then they'll actually nibble to the ground, and all of a sudden you'll have them actually going horizontal across the ground. Paspalum, is a classic one for this. If you've got a paspalum and it hasn't allowed to be recovered, it will actually go virtually flat. It'll be like a carpet grass on the ground. But if you go out and look at a fully recovered paspalum plant that's allowed to recover, its leaves are vertical from the tillers right at the ground and go up rather than going out. So most grasses will take this sort of habit and try and protect themselves as much as they can. Eventually, they do run out of energy and disappear. So grazing is that point of when our animals are in defoliating, and it's that contact point between our plants and animals. So how long are they actually in there taking a bite and eating those plants? Overgrazing happens on an individual plant by plant basis. So as I sort of started to learn about this, you heard people talk about, oh, that paddock's overgrazed. Well, it's actually not the paddock that overgrazed, it's the plants in the paddock that are overgrazed. So we can actually look at a paddock and see what might on the surface look like a healthy paddock, but there may actually still be individually overgrazed plants in that paddock. And they're generally the best plants too, because the animals will, when we move them into a paddock, will go and eat the best stuff first. And they'll walk around stalky stuff or tall stuff or stuff that they don't normally eat, and they'll keep eating the plants they really like. And as they regrow, they're also then the sweetest things, because they're regrowing with sugars from their base, and they'll start to go back and regraze those. So if they stay too long, they'll then have that second bite and regraze that plant. When we get to the other side of it is then having a time when, after we've taken those animals out, that grazing's finished, that the plant then has full time to be able to replenish the energy that it has, that it needs to get itself regrowing, because our animals have defoliated it. They might have defoliated like this plant here in the picture, where we've taken pretty much most of the photosynthesizing leaves off. And so for it to start to regrow, it actually needs to utilize energy from its root base. Okay. So I'll just flick forward here. See, oh no, it's not there. I've got a picture I thought was there of actually what that looks like in the plant. So we need to be able to allow that plant to actually start to grow some leaves and then photosynthesize and get energy back into its roots that it's actually had to use to start grazing. So in our planning, and I'll put this in now, is if in doubt, if we don't know exactly how long it's taking to recover, then longer is generally better. We won't get to a point of applying rest until we're into 12, 18 months, 2 years. So leaving plants to recover for long periods is actually better for them than actually repeatedly regrazing, even if it means we're actually staying in paddocks for slightly longer. So generally, you're better off having an animal have a second bite as long as you've then had that plant to fully recover once they've gone out. So when we look at what happens when they graze, if they use around 50% of the thing, and what the general thing used to be that someone used to say that they eat the plant and then the roots die and then they've got to regrow the roots. But actually what happens is that when that plant gets grazed, the roots stop growing. And they stop growing for a period of time until it can actually replenish the energy that it's used to start that growth process, get the photosynthesis happening again, and then they'll start to grow again. So in the first one here, if we use around 50%, then about 50% of the roots stop growing until that is replaced again. If we come back to 70%, the roots stop growing for about 17 days. And if we go to 90%, they'll continue to stop growing, and then, but 100% of the roots will stop growing. So you can see the more severe we go down here, the more impact we have on that plant and its ability to recover. So this is a picture from Judy Earle's research, looking at a particular plant that we have up here on the tablelands. It's paddock lovegrass, or I think, and it's a summer perennial plant that we have, and it gives us a good cover because it actually goes to seed late in the summer and gives us like quite a good cover that protects our soil surface from frost and things. But in this experiment, they actually, this was done in pots, and what they did is in the first pot there, they let the plant grow, and every 2 weeks they cut it off at the level that you can see there. So it was effectively a severe graze every 2 weeks. The second one, they did that every 4 weeks. The third one, they did it every 8 weeks. And the final one you can see is uncut. And the difference between the 8 week and the uncut is much at all. And the root mass and the total quantity was pretty much the same. So in that 8-week period, that plant had its life cycle to be able to recover and maintain all the energy in its roots. When it was being cut every 2 weeks, it probably started with the roots that look like the uncut. Every time that it grazed and it had to utilize that energy, it started putting that energy back into growing leaves, and then all of a sudden it got taken off. So it didn't actually get the ability to start to replenish that energy. So eventually those roots, well, everything gets taken out of them, and then they do start to die off at that point. So they die off over time. So during the growing season, most of our plants will start to regrow within about 3 to 5 days. So when the growing season, we want our graze period to be short, and 3 to 5 days is probably, the maximum we want to be going out to if we can. And then after we've defaulted that, we need them to replenish their reserves. So I don't know whether you can see this here, but I've got a graph here, and I'll draw up another one in a sec. But what this is showing, and this is, if I haven't already done it, I'll make sure I send you out the grazing ebook, and this graph is in the book, where this is the S-curve of the growth. And I'll just stop sharing here for a sec. Sorry. Hang on. So you can actually see it. There you go. That might be a bit easier to see. All right. So our growth plants will grow in this sigmoid S-curve. So if we've defoliated them, they'll start off growing quite slow. And in our stage 1 of our growth, what we call stage 1, they'll have a little bit of growth. They'll start to replenish their roots. And then when we get into stage 2, we'll go a lot of growth and a lot of leaf going back on. And then as we get up into here, this is when they go into senescence and they start to put up seed heads, and the growth slows down and it plateaus out. So you can see here, if this red marks here indicate equal time spaces of growth depending on where the plant is. So if we graze this plant here and then we come back and regraze at this point, you can see this is the amount of growth that's happened during that period. If we grazed from this point for the equal amount of time as we did the first time, but we're in stage 2, you can see the plant is actually able to grow a lot more within that same time period, dependent on the growth size. So that comes back to that 50%, 70%, 90% amount that we take from a plant. So if you're actually down here grazing, you need to actually give a lot longer recovery period when you get into that severe grazing point than if you're actually doing a less severe growth point.
And is that the same if they're just being trampled?
That's a good question, Paul. It would be similar, because when you're trampling, we're effectively interrupting the photosynthesis process. And so if those leaves can't photosynthesize, then yes, it needs to grow leaf to be able to put that energy back in and then be able to grow itself. So if we have a look at this, and I'll draw this up here. So if we start, I'll just bring this a little bit closer for you. I've tried doing this on the computer, it doesn't really work. So if we actually start with a fully recovered plant, and we actually put our animals in to graze, and we graze them for, let's say, 3 days. So this is our graze period. Once we leave that paddock, that plant starts to regrow, and it does that S-curve we just saw on the previous chart. So for that plant to be fully recovered, we need to get back up to here or above here of this point. Now, if we look at what happens from the root system point of view, if we're going for a fully recovered root system, we've got all this energy sitting in the roots. When it starts to regrow, the plant, because we've eaten all of the leaf off it, the plant starts to draw down the energy from our root system and in its crown. And then as it starts to grow here, it starts to replenish that energy again until we get back up and we've got our full energy in that roots replenished. Now, if we have too short a recovery period, we might say, oh, look, we've got some growth on our plants. We're going to come back in and we're going to graze here. And so we might have another graze period. Now, the plant on the surface might look, reasonable. But what we see is our root energy still hasn't been replenished. And so what happens is we actually then have to draw down on that root energy again. Now, if we keep doing that and our graze period's not long enough, then that root energy will spiral down and disappear. And that's when we start to lose those plants out of that system. So you saw that from that paddock lovegrass picture, where over a 12-month period, that grass lost all its root base and then was quite an impoverished plant at the end of that. So we wanted to make sure that that recovery period allows both the plant and the root system to replenish itself, and that's where it's key. All right. So is there any questions on that before I go any further? So this is where recovery periods are focused around our plants, and that's what helps us get the the longevity of those plants. And if we maintain that process, then perennials will be perennial; they will be there forever. So we can keep them within our system. So we've got to be able to manage our landscape to be able to do this. And we talked about Paul had issued with weaners there about stock paddock mob numbers. So let's just have a look at a couple of examples of what happens with graze period and recovery period based on the number of paddocks and herds that we might have. So in this example, we've got 320 hectares. We've cut up into 32 beautiful, nice, equal 10-hectare paddocks. It would be great, wouldn't it? All the same size. Everybody's happy. Love those. In this example, we've got 4 flocks of sheep of 100 sheep. So they're actually in each of these sectors, they're grazing in a rotation, but we've got 4 rotations of 8 paddocks each flock. We've got a density of 1 sheep per hectare. Okay, so we've got them across this area. And if we have a 160-day period, within a 160-day period, each of these flocks will be grazed for 20 days in each paddock, and each one will have recovery of 140 days. So if we have got to go around one of these sections in 160 days, they'll be in each one for 20 days. And so the paddocks they're not grazing will have 140 days recovery. Okay. Now, let's look at the same property, same number of stock. So 320 hectares, 32 paddocks. But this time, we've got 1 flock. We've decided we're going to chuck all the flocks together and put them into one area. So we've now got the 400 sheep grazing across 32 paddocks. We've done a couple of things. One, we've increased our density. So instead of 1 sheep per hectare, we're now doing 4 sheep per hectare. So that's giving us a bit more density. They'd be selecting grasses a little bit less, and they'd be grazing a higher utilisation across that landscape. If we look at the same 160-day period, our graze period has reduced from 20 days to 5 days in each paddock, and our recovery period has increased to 155 days. So we were at 140, we're now going to 150. So we've done 2 things. We've looked and said, well, actually, we're not staying too long because now we're in a growing period and grasses will start to regrow in that 3 to 5 days. So we're not staying too long. And we've extended the recovery period, so we're giving those plants plenty of time to recover. Okay, whereas before we were there for 20 days. There was a pretty good chance in a growing season that we would be having a second bite, probably even a third bite on plants that were growing in that season. And then we're actually giving them a shorter period of time to recover at the same time. Okay, so recovery is our key. We don't want to stay too long and we don't want to come back too early. And if in doubt, stay longer. So if in doubt, if we had that and we said, look, we want to make sure we get 160, 170 days, and we increased our graze period to 6 or 7 days in each paddock. Now there's potential that we might have a few plants that would have a second bite, but we're ensuring that we're giving them a very long recovery to be able to get back from that severe grazing situation. So our recovery period has to dictate our grazing period, okay? So we calculate our graze period, how long we're going to be in each paddock based on knowing what our recovery period is. So here's an example. So we've got a 30-day recovery period. We want to have 30 days for each of these paddocks to recover before we regraze them. In this case, we've got 4 paddocks. Okay, so where we're grazing in paddock 1 here, so it's not recovering while we're grazing. So we divide our 30 days by the number of paddocks that we're not grazing to give us how long our graze period is in each paddock. So in this case, it's 10 days. Okay, so there's a little calculation, which is in the booklet, so you don't have to remember it. But our graze period equals our recovery period divided by the number of paddocks we've got minus 1, because we're grazing in 1, it's not recovering. Okay. Now, if our recovery period is 90 days, what would our graze period for our paddock be? Anybody do that for me? So we've got 4 paddocks.
30 days?
Yep, 30 days. So we've got 4 paddocks. We take off 1, so we've got 3. We divide 3 into our 90, and it gives us our 30-day recovery graze period. So this is the essential part of it. So it's just switching that thing around to focus on that recovery period rather than how long you're grazing to make sure. So we want to focus on our overgrazing of plants during the growing season. That's one of our key focuses. So as I said before, this is root quantity after 12 months. So, giving it more recovery gets us to have a healthier root base and that plant to continue growing through that season. Dr. Christine Jones did a similar thing, and this is where the discussion around roots dying off came from, one of these original photos. But what happens is this is the continually regrazing and then the energy being sucked out of those roots so that they actually start to die off. Now, the other part of this is if we actually keep our grass, in this sort of health, then as that plant regrows, around 30 to 40% of the sugars that it produces from photosynthesis each day get pumped out through those roots to feed our soil biology and put carbon into our soil. And this is what they call a liquid carbon pathway. So we've got the brown carbon pathway where we might have old material or like, as Paul said before, we've trampled material onto that soil surface and it's got to dry off and decompose through a decomposition process. And that's our brown carbon pathway. Our green carbon pathway is where we've got photosynthesis happening, taking energy, converting that into sugars, and those sugars being pumped down as a 30 to 40%, then go out through the roots into the soil to feed biology, to add glomalin and other things to our soil structure that help us. Paul, you have a question?
So you actually work on your recovery period of 30 days, and then you just divide your number of paddocks you have. So the recovery period is minimum of 30 days?
Oh, no, it will depend. This is just an example. So depending on your temperature, your rainfall, pasture species, a whole range of things will determine that. And we'll have a look at how we measure that in a second. I've got some pictures here on that. So, if our recovery period is 30 days, so we'll have this. So we want to be able to actually, this race is 60 days, for example. So if we had a dry period, things are slowing down, gets a bit hot, stuff will grow, grow slower. If we then jumped into a period, and I'll show you an example here of how quickly it can happen. So this particular example, and if you keep a note on the dates up the top here as I go through. So this is 4 days after the season started. So this is actually in central Queensland. It's on a black soil base, and this is probably buffel grass. But you can see here we've got a good, I'd say close to 100% ground cover. Even though we don't have green plants, we've actually got litter covering across the whole surface there. So if rain falls on that, and this is 4 days after they had rain, it's actually hitting that litter, having time to soak in. I can't see any examples of water running on that surface at all, and it's soaking into the ground. So 4 days after the started, and we have to be grazing somewhere. Okay, so we're still grazing through our paddocks. So in this case, the stock will come in and they've grazed this, and you can see that plant has been grazed down. That was the 8th of November. So 9th of November, this is 1 day after the graze. You can see a little change, maybe a little bit. Then we got 2 days after the graze, and on the 10th, 3 days, 4 days. And so in that case, within 4 days, if I just go back through that, that's what the plant looked like before it got grazed. And that's 4 days later. So in this case, you would say that that plant might be recovered beyond where it was when we first grazed it. Now, we won't necessarily come back after that, at that point, sorry, and we'd give it probably, another, a week after that. But in this case, 5 to 10 days, and that particular plant, and you can see even these little plants around it are all growing and things as well. Okay, so we've got some very fast growing plants in the right beautiful conditions in this situation. And a lot of those summer perennial tropical species will grow very, very fast like that when the seasonal conditions hit them. And on the coastal areas of New South Wales up towards us, one of the grasses that a lot of people have a bit of problem with is a species of a variety of Ceteria, and it can grow humongous amounts of feed very, very quickly, and then goes quite moribund and quite lignified fairly quickly, and so productivity can drop off for his stock. So being able to maintain performance on that can be a challenge. So this is where we need to focus on our diversity, so we're not just a single species. So if we got recovery periods like that one we just saw, which is fast, we eat it, and then within this period is 30 days. So within that 60 day, that plant's had 2 recovery periods we've gone through. Now, if in doubt, you go longer. So if you're not sure, but how we can measure that is we can put in exclusion cages. And once you're starting to get to know your land and how fast things are growing, starting off doing this, we did this when we bought a new property. We did it for a couple of years so we could see what it looked like in different parts of the season with different rainfall events. So we got an idea of how fast things were growing. So here's a paddock that we're ready to graze, and we stick in a cage. Now, it could be a few gates. It could be a bit of electric tape around an area. When I was dividing paddocks, I'd leave a strip between them. I'd sort of move the tape across and leave a bit of a wedge. In this case, it's an IBC shuttle cage, which we've used as well. So we've put that in and we've pinned it down, put a couple of steel posts in, because cattle, as we know, love to rub on stuff. And even sheep. We've had some sheep in a paddock the other day, and one of these IBC cages actually had a poplar tree in the middle of it. We went, that'd be right. So I need some lambs. The lambs pushed the cage so they could eat the poplar tree, and they moved it across the landscape. So pin them down, always best. So we put our stock in to graze it, and you can see everything outside the cage has been grazed, and we've got plants that we haven't grazed inside the cage. We then monitor that to let it recover. And what we want is we want to be able to remove that cage and not be able to really see where we grazed and where we didn't graze. So you can see the grasses outside look equivalent to what's in it. And if you try and get them so that they actually come back to what's in the cage, then you'll be in that situation where every time you come back into the paddock, you'll have a little bit more grass each time you come around. Now, depending on your rainfall, the pasture species you've got, the temperature, your whole range of things can influence this. So you need to get an idea and know your area. So doing a cage is a really good example. So when we've got slow growth, we move slower because we need longer recovery. So we want to give the grass that's in front of us more time. And when we got fast growing, we actually increase decrease our recovery period and decrease our grazing period. If we're in doubt, go slower. And I write that on the top of my grazing charts to remind me all the time. So you will get into less problems if you go slower than if you go faster. And I had someone the other day I was doing a call with, and they went, oh, yeah, we're doing this, and this is where the season is. We're doing 2-day grazes, and we're getting around. But what we're finding is when we get back to the start, we don't have enough grass. The grass, like we're having to feed hay. And I said, well, okay, if that's the case, we're in our growing season, it would seem that your recovery period is not long enough. So we need to extend your recovery period out. And they went, well, but if I extend my recovery period out, that means my graze period is longer in each paddock, and I don't have enough grass for the stock I've got. And this is where we then go, okay, well, if that's the case, then your stocking rate isn't matching your carrying capacity. You're actually overstocked with what's available. And so we then have to hammer out some strategies of how we manage that. Now, we can supplementary feed if we've got hay available. That's one strategy. Or we have this flexibility of different types of enterprises so that we can actually destock. So you might have trade cattle that you might sell off. You might have adjustment stock that come and go. You know, there's various different strategies that you can do with different enterprises to be able to do that. Okay. So matching, you know, that growth rate is critical to get our recovery period. Okay. So let's have a look at some examples here. And we've got where we've got the number of paddocks, our recovery day, and a graze period that we've set here based on the graze. So we've got 8 days. We've got 30 days recovery. So we divide that out and we get our graze period being 4 days. Now, if we're in a rapid growth, and if we sort of get ourselves into a system and we just stick with this, and it's going fast and slow depending on the thing. If we're in a rapid growth, our graze period is fair. It's 4 days. It's, you know, it's not long. It's right in that sort of 3 to 5 days. And our recovery period is probably going to be good. Okay, so we've got 30-day recovery in fast growth. Now, if we go into a slow growth period, our graze period is still, you know, low. So we won't have an issue with overgrazing plants that are starting to regrow. But if our grass is slower and our recovery is longer than 30 days, then we're hitting into a danger period. Sorry, Paul, yes, you have a question?
The recovery period, is it the same for improved pasture to natives?
Well, it depends on the natives. As I said, it depends on the season. Happy to catch up with you if you want to talk about your particular species. But, you know, like a Microlina or a wallaby grass and stuff would have a slower recovery than, say, kangaroo grass, you know, Demeter, during the summer. It would grow quite quickly. So it sort of depends. And then some of those native grasses can actually grow faster than improved pastures, if the conditions are right for them. So I know it's a depends question. Sorry, Paul.
The 30 days, is it just a good rule of thumb?
Yeah, look, the rule of thumb I use during the growing season, if you've got reasonable rainfall, I don't go below around 45 to 50 days. And then as I go out into the slower growing period, I go out to 180 to 200 days recovery. So I'm constantly sort of moving between those two sort of extremes. So I've got stack of grass growing at the moment up here. I don't have enough mouths. We're just about to buy some trade cattle so that we can utilize some of the opportunity we've got in front of us. But even still, I'm on about a 60-day recovery, and I'm doing that because we've had a couple of pretty tough seasons in the last 2 with really dry winter, short summers, and I want to make sure that I'm looking after all the perennials that were being they've got impacted because of those short seasons. So I'm maintaining a long recovery period, but I'm also working with about 45 paddocks. So I've got a good number of paddocks that I can utilize to get that, to keep a graze period down to about 2 or 3 days. But our situation also, our graze period set not too short because I don't live on either of the properties that we manage. So, opportunity at the moment would be to be splitting paddocks up into small areas and moving every day and getting some good recovery, getting some good impact. But economically, I can't go and drive out and move stock every day. So I have to set a grazing period that both fits the landscape as well as my context from a management point of view. All right. So Paul, your central tablelands, did you say?
No, I'm at Dungowan.
Oh, you're at Dungowan. Okay, so you're up here. Yeah, okay. So, and if you native or introduced pastures, like what would be the major species you've got there?
Natives and a lot of kikuyu.
Right, Kikuyu, yeah. So Kikuyu would be one where, yeah, you would be on probably a 30-day recovery with the rain that we've had. Unless you're in one of those little spots that have missed it, but most of the area I think has got it. So Kikuyu can grow really quickly. And it's one of those ones you saw can actually extend right out into the non-growing season as the rain drops off, because it doesn't need as much to continue to produce later on. So yeah. So in the same situation here, where we had 8 paddocks, if we've got a 90-day recovery period that we need, then that means our grace period's been pushed out now to 13 days. If we're in fast growth, then 13 days we're in the point of danger where we'll actually be regrazing, regrowing plants. But our recovery period will still be good because we've still got 90 days. It's fast growing. It's a bit longer than it necessarily needs to be, but more plants will be grazed in the paddocks as we go across. We're there for 13 days, and then even if our slow growth, then we're still got good, because in 13 days it's probably about 7 to 10 days. If it's a slow growth, those plants will start to regrow. So there's a lower chance of actually regrazing, and we've still got good recovery period. Now, if we increase our paddock numbers, and we've got a 30-day recovery period, we're down to 1 day graze. So you can see that we've got 31 paddocks. We take 1 off, divide that by our 30, gives us our 1 day graze. In this case, we've got good rapid growth, good grazing for our rapid growth. And our issue is over here in slow growth, in that we're actually we're coming back too soon, really in 30 days. So we actually can be overgrazing, and because we're have smaller paddocks, then we'll have of a high stock utilization. So we'll have severe grazing, and we really won't have enough grass to come back. Same here, if we've got 90-day recovery, we go to 3-day grazers. So we've increased our graze period for 90 days. Then it's green across the board. And then final one here. And this is all in the book, so be able to read this, the notes that go with this. Now, I've just realized that we've gone over time. Is there any right if I keep going for about another 5 minutes? Yep, okay. We just had Narissa and a couple of guys drop off. They'll be able to catch up on the recording. So the next thing is, how much do our plants, our animals eat? How much do I have, and how long do I need to create a product? So you might need a particular thing to create a product. So this comes into our feed budgeting. So I just want to do this, so this gives you something to go away this week. Paul talked about having done this. So we've got 2 different seasons, and you can see in these pictures here. We've got our non-growing, obviously, in this season, and we've got a pretty good growing season here. We've got a tall Paspidium type plant here, and a fair bit of diversity in this one. These cows are enjoying. So there's a couple of things we need to know. We need to look at what animal units are we managing. So who's I'll ask the other way. Who's an LSU? Who uses livestock units as their measurement? Anybody? Nope, everybody's DSC. Yeah, usually Queensland border south, we're all DSC. Queensland border north, it's LSUs. And if you get it right up in North Queensland, it's adult equivalents, which is something completely different again. But they're all based on the energy and nutritional requirements for a dry animal. So a DSC is a 50 kilo dry sheep, and its nutritional requirements at maintenance and how much it needs. An LSU, it's a 450 kilo dry cow or steer at maintenance, and there's a 1:7 ratio between one DSC. Actually, one LSU is 7 DSCs. So when we're looking at forage, we want to measure animal days of grazing. So the animal days of grazing is how much feed is needed for one animal day or one DSC day. So if we've got a dry 50 kilo weather, how much feed does it need for a day in my paddock, and how big an area is that? Okay, so it's a quantity, and it works out to be about 1 kilo of dry matter per day. Now, there's some nutritional ins and outs of this, but we'll put, we'll look at that as we go on. But we're looking at pure quantity to start with on this. So it's about 1 kilo of dry matter per day. That equates to around, I think it's around 13 or 14 megajoules of energy per day that they need. That's how it's actually calculated. It's actually on an energy requirement. If it's an LSU, we're talking, about 10 kilos a day. And it can vary though from sort of 7 to 11 or 12, depending on the conditions. But we work on about 10 kilos a day. So what does 1 kilo look like? And we'll look at that in a second, as far as how we would measure that in the paddock. So if we've got here, depending on the type of animal we've got, we convert it to those DSE. So here we've got a 300 kilo steer growing at 1 kilo a day. So we're above maintenance. We're a lighter animal, but we're well above maintenance. So that animal would be eating around 10 kilos of dry matter a day, which is about 10 DSE. So a 60 kilo ewe with twin lambs, and I've got a few of these running around the paddock at the moment, are eating around 3 kilos of dry matter a day, or 3 DSE. So when we're looking at our different animal types, we need to look at different ratings for those, but we always come back to that base DSE rating. So if we've got one steer grazing a paddock for 100 days, then it consumes 100 animal days of feed. So if we've got 10 steers for 10 days, again, 100 animal days, or 100 steers for 1 day with 100 animal days. So how much feed does 100 steers need for a day is the same as what one steer would need for 100 days. Okay, so depending on what we've got LSUs here. So we've got our steer here at dry. Now that's not, be just a maintenance, not growing. A cow and calf, about 1.5 LSUs. Wean calf drops down, and then a bull, doesn't matter which one of these you've got, they're probably about 2 to 2.5, especially some of the bigger ones. We've got some tables, DSE tables, that give you, so you can go and find how heavy your animal is, whether they're dry, pregnant, lactating, merino, crossbreds, all those sort of things, so you can work out what your rating is. And then to be able to go out and look at all your different animal classes, give them a rating, and then get yourself a total of what your total requirements for the stock that you have at any one time. So then we need to go and measure what we've got. So that's what we need. Now we want to measure what we've got. So we can go out and we can do feed samples. We can look at our previous stuff. Once you start calculating your grazing charts, I've got some here on the wall from previous seasons. I can see what different paddocks performed previous years, and know what the quantity might be for similar sort of growing. We measure as we graze. So once we're going in and out of paddocks, we might have calculated something, put our animals in there for our graze period, have calculated what it should be when they come out, and then we can do an assessment and see that. So we're monitoring it. So there's a few different ways to do it. So the first one here I'll show you is the ruler. So Judy Earle and Lewis Kahn did the research on this. Judy's another holistic management educator doing grazing planning. So we measure our height of our grass. So you can see here we've got quite a tall summer perennial type grass here. We've got some annual grasses in there as well. And where we're actually measuring is where the bulk of the leaf area is. So we're not measuring right to the total height. We're measuring to where the bulk is. And generally what I do is I'll get my hat, my Cobra hat, and I'll chuck it on the ground and just give it a little pat, just so it sort of sits up on the grass. And then I'll measure how high that is. Or you might get your foolscap folder or something and drop it down, and it gives you a height. So you have a look at, so you might have grass seeds that are up to 30, 40, 50 centimeters, but the leaf area might only be 10 or 20 centimeters at the base of that. So that's the bit you want to measure. And then depending on your ground cover, you can do a conversion or a calculation on the number of kilos of dry matter. Now, there's a couple of booklets I can point you to so you can find this yourself and be able to do that. So I can point that for your particular area. We can then do some calculations utilizing that one. There's the stack methods, which is sole, toe, ankle, calf, similar to the ruler. And you're talking about 300, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 as you go up, kilos of dry matter as you go up your thing. Now, what we generally teach you guys to do, and this is what we do, it's what we do all the time, is we actually go out and measure a paddock. And when I do this with you face to face, I give you a bag. Grab yourself a calico shopping bag, and I usually have one sitting here, but I don't at the moment. Like a shopping bag. It used to be the old plastic bags, but grab yourself a shopping bag, and then go out into your paddock and actually harvest as your animals would eat everything that you think that they would eat, and put that into the bag. When that bag is full, like stuffed full, you'll have approximately, and that's like a sheep's stomach, think about the rumen, about how much feed it would need. So you can then measure how big of the area that's taken. So you can see here in the pictures, you can work that out on a square, and you can work out how many square that is. What we do is we park the quad bike, which is about 1 meter wide, and we'll step out 10 meters and turn around and look at the strip that's 1 meter wide between us and the quad bike. And we'll go, okay, is that enough for us to put a sheep in for a day? Is that going to fill its stomach? Now, if that's the case, then that's 1,000 DSE days per hectare. So if we take that, that's 10 square meters. We divide it into a hectare, which is 10,000 square meters, and that gives us 1,000 DSE days per hectare. Okay. If we say, oh, actually that's more than enough, then we might step in a couple of steps, and then we'll work out what the square meterage is of how big it needs. That's really sort of very simple way of doing it. I've got a video on that, which I can send out to you, or I can have a chat to you about it. It's pretty simple. That's the first step we need to do as far as measuring our feed and knowing what we've got. At different times of the year, you do this at the start of your non-growing season to work out what feed you've got to go through the non-growing. But I also like to do it now to say, okay, I'm about to go and buy some trade cattle, and everything's growing very, very well at the moment. I go, okay, how many cattle can I buy? Okay, how much feed have I got? And then so I'll go and do an assessment across my paddocks and do a calculation and work out what my feed tally is. And then I can sort of do an assessment and say, okay, well, if I've got that much feed, it's going to take me 150 odd days to put 120 odd kilos onto my cattle. Then I can work out whether I've got enough feed plus a residual to go into the next winter to be able to take those cattle on, and how many I can take on. Okay, so you can really useful to be able to do calculations like that. When we restocked after the drought, we did that calculation to sort of get us an idea of saying, well, okay, I don't know, I got a lot of rain, got a lot of grass growth, but I didn't know whether it would continue to rain. So I went, okay, well, if I bought stock now and this was all the grass I had for the next 12 months, how many stock could I run? Paul?
How many paddocks would you do that in?
Once you get to know your paddocks, you can do it in sort of different zones. If you know that paddocks are similar, then you can sort of do that. When we do our assessment for winter, we actually print out our paddock list and we go around and do every paddock. Only takes us, it's like a half day sort of job. And once you get used to it, it's pretty quick to go in and do it in the paddock. If it's on our smaller place, we sort of do it in 2 halves. We've got one half of the property. It's about 65, 70 hectares. One half is all fairly similar with similar species and stuff, and similar growth patterns. And I'll do an assessment in that. And I've also got figures from a grazing chart that I know how long each paddock's recovered and those sort of information. And then we've got the other half, which has got a lot of power tussock and various other things in it, and we'll rate that sort of on average and similar. I always do it fairly conservatively. So I'll always be on the bottom side of really what's available. So we work out how big a square we need for an animal day, divide that into 10,000, which is how many square meters we have in a hectare. this is why you need to start talking in hectares and not acres, because I'm pretty sure no one knows how many square meters are in an acre. And I know I can't calculate that in my head. Whereas a hectare I can. And then we can give us how many animal days per hectare we have for the total size of the paddock. So if it's a 1.8 hectare paddock or a 5 hectare paddock or a 10 hectare paddock, we can multiply that out. Okay. And what I might do, stop sharing there. So thank you everybody for your patience. Sorry, I went over. Any questions before we finish up? And I know we've got a few more sessions to go through. We'll get through this, and I'm hoping that by the last two sessions in December, we'll actually get into actually sort of the ins and outs of the grazing chart and a few things there to help you put your plans together if you haven't already got one going. So before we finish up, any final questions, queries? If anybody wants to catch up with me, look, I'm available. Just drop me an email and I can organise some time to have a chat to you.
Oh, Glenn, I was just going to say briefly, how much, and I think you answered the question, how much wriggle room do you leave yourself with estimating this feed by the squares?
Oh, look, be generally conservative, I find, because like my wife and I do it, and I've been doing it for a while. She's sort of new to it, so what we'll do is, especially on the we're taking over our family farm, so my dad's been doing this for 20 years, and so we'll go and do an assessment, and then we'll take that assessment to him, and then get him to double check a few paddocks to see whether how close we were to what his wisdom and experience is. But like the example I showed, said when I restocked after the drought, I made the assumption that the grass I had standing in the paddock is all I had for 12 months. Now, there was a pretty good chance that I was going to get growth and more in that 12 months, but that gave me a starting position to then be able to put those stock on. Once you've done your assessments and you start to implement your grazing plan, you're going to monitor as you go in and out of every paddock. So that's when we get into the replanning process. You might say, oh, look, there's 2,500 DSC days in here. I've got plenty. You put your stock in there, you come back 3 days later and move them and go, oh, gee whiz, actually, I've got not as much as I thought. My calculations aren't right. I need to redo it. And so you then go and adjust all the time. So you're always in this replanning process as you go through with your monitoring. And that's the key, in holistic management, we want to make sure, because humans, we always are optimistic. We always think that we've got it right and we know what's going on. Invariably, we will be wrong.
Yeah. So you're basically getting feedback every day on whether your plan is on track.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's that constant monitoring, and it's looking at those feeds as you move stock all the time, as well as looking at their gut feel and their dung scores and various things from an animal point of view. We're always monitoring to check when we're going off track, because I probably get it wrong, and probably 8 times out of 10 I probably do get it wrong, but I'm monitoring and I can readjust on a regular basis, and so I won't make a detrimental thing. Now, in saying that, I always focus on effective grazing, not perfect grazing. So we're never going to be perfect. You're never going to graze the perfect amount for the perfect recovery period, for the perfect number of stock, for the perfect performance. It's a unicorn. It doesn't happen. But if we're monitoring and reviewing on a constant basis, then we can be moving along that track to improve our landscape and still perform and get ourselves a good economic return. Okay.
So to start, Glenn, obviously we don't have the feed or the paddocks, in the perfect or the most effective condition. How long should you actually start? Just with a day, but then you're still going to try and rest everything. So,
well, this is where doing your assessment across your paddocks to see what your tally is now, and then getting starting. You're getting to the end of. Well, sorry, no, we're right in our growing season, so you're done down. I was thinking you. you're focusing around, I'd say around that 40-day recovery period to start with, and then working out what your graze period is based on that as a recovery with the number of paddocks you've got. And then doing an assessment to say, well, if I had my stock in that paddock for that many days, have I got enough feed? So looking at whether our stocking rate matches our carrying capacity. If it doesn't, then I'm happy to help, look at some decisions around that and how you might adjust it and what some strategies might be to start with. But at the moment, I'd say you're probably in the best position seasonally wise to start doing that stuff now, given that I would expect you've got some good grass growth and stuff happening in front of you. And then we can make sure that as you go into the non-growing or slow growing season into April, May, that you'll have sufficient feed available to get you through that next winter and continue to perform.
That's the challenge at the moment, yes.
Yeah, especially if you've got a Kikuyu-based pasture, because it turns to crap in winter. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, no worries. Okay, thanks everybody, and we will catch you again next week. Any questions, please drop me a line, give me a call. Happy to have a chat.